Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. We're happy to have you joining us for another episode where we delve into our working relationship as a married couple making adult games together. Now let's get seedy.
Last episode, we talked about how we deal with conflicting desires and ideas from our players. Today, we're going to tackle two related questions about how we handle that between each other as a partnership. One of our team members, Hondo, asked, how do you deal with differences of opinion in directions the story should go? Creatives can get stuck in their own ideas or vision. How do you overcome that, or is it even an issue? And Scruffington on our Discord said, your ability to communicate as a couple and business partners is impressive. Is there a story arch for how that developed between you two, or has that open mentality been a constant? So we felt like we could address both these questions just by talking about how we handle disagreements that we have as our business partnership. First of all, I think that it's important to understand that we each have our own areas that we are kind of responsible for. I don't feel like it's something that we talked about ahead of time and agreed upon, but certainly we have our own areas where we kind of get final say and we're allowed to veto the other person, and the other person doesn't get mad about it. So I think an example of an area for me is with the writing. I'm the expert in writing. So if what I want to do is usually what wins, I certainly take suggestions, and the Omega looks at every single script and does what I call punching up. You know, he will go through and add little jokes or change the wording on things or make suggestions. And, you know, I either accept them or I don't. And we don't really talk about it beyond that. It's just understood that, you know, I appreciate his suggestions, but at the end of the day, I'm going to do what I think is best.
What I've never told her is I actually go cry in the corner every time she makes my suggestions.
Yeah, I had a feeling. If I come to the Omega and I say, I really want to do this in the game, you know, is that something that you're willing to do, or is that possible from a coding perspective? You know, whatever he says goes in that regard. That obviously helps to resolve a lot of conflicts that could pop up, in that if it has to do with a particular area of development, we already have an unspoken rule about who's going to deal with that.
And then another thing is we have very different strengths, which is a strength in itself, as you would imagine, which is Jocelyn is much more organized than I am. And I wholeheartedly appreciate it because I'm just like chaotic energy. I'm a mess when it comes to that. I have a lot of ideas, but I, for the life of me, cannot be super organized other than keeping things in my mind that I want to do or that I know that I need to do.
Yeah, I would say, though, even though we have very different strengths that complement each other, in another way, like we're very similar and we think in a very similar way. So I think that from my point of view, that's what attracted me to you in the first place, is that I feel like when we talk about our reasonings behind things and we explain our thought process behind things, we typically understand each other and we can explain things in a way that the other person understands. And often we think very similarly and come to the same conclusions even without talking about it. But yet we still have these kind of very different aspects of our personality that complement each other. You know, when it comes to like booking a trip, like I'm always the one that makes the packing list and, you know, make sure that we don't forget anything. Whereas like I'm much more indecisive about a lot of other things like booking the hotels and things like that. So, you know, we kind of have a division of labor there that works. But at the end of the day, my packing system makes sense to you, and you understand it, and I understand, you know, your methodology for looking for things. So we think similarly, but I think in terms of the actions and the things that we do, we kind of, whatever I'm good at, you're bad at, and kind of vice versa.
And I think to go with what you're saying too, that we talked about before, is in history, like I've had a much higher appetite for risk than you have had. And so that's where you're saying, like, I kind of fill the gap. Like you're saying, book the hotel, book the flights, like actually clicking the button where it's going to be a very large purchase, you know, that gives you a little bit of anxiety or nervousness. Whereas I'm like, you know what, F it. I'm just going to click that button. You know, if it shits the bed, it shits the bed. You know, we'll deal with it as it comes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we have very much complement each other in that way. And I think too, you know, when we first sat down to kind of think about what we wanted to say to answer this question, we started off by saying, well, we don't really disagree very often. And then the more we talked about it, the more we realized that we do disagree quite a bit. It's not like a huge blowout argument every time we disagree. And so it's just not as memorable to us. But when we sat down and started thinking about it, we started coming up with tons of examples of times when we had disagreed. But I think, again, a way in which we're very similar is that we're both very even-keeled and have very calm, easygoing personalities, and we're not fiery. And so even though we can get very heated and passionate and stubborn about our ideas, we're not the type to just completely lose our temper and, name call and scream at each other and slam doors. Like it all, it just doesn't escalate to that level. So even though we can get passionate and heated, there's still a level of respect and restraint and control that allows us to, to resolve it before things get too ridiculous.
But generally speaking, as Jocelyn's saying, we're both very even keeled and don't really, go crazy a whole lot.
So yeah, like I said, we realize that we do disagree quite often, but because we're able to resolve it pretty quickly, because once, one of us explains our thought process to the other person, typically that's enough to convince the other person because we do think very similarly. So, also too, I think what's important is that we are both very solutions driven. And so, when we find that we've had something that we've disagreed about or had an issue about, 2 or 3 times, typically that's when we start going, okay, what can we change in our workflow or our way of doing things or, in our perspective in order to not have this be a disagreement again. So I think both of us are very efficiency minded and that extends to let's not waste time arguing about the same things over and over again. Let's find a permanent solution to this disagreement so that it never, we don't have to keep having this. And I think that's a place where a lot of people can get stuck in that cycle of just having the same disagreements over and over again and not being able to step back and think about from outside of the box, how can we just prevent this disagreement from happening? Even if we're never going to agree on it, maybe we can change something that will keep it from being a point of contention.
Yeah, that being said, we do operate in kind of a different way when either one of us brings ideas to one another, especially if they're really big ideas. For me, from my perspective, in my mind, when I've made a decision, even if I haven't made one specifically jointly with you, like I'll have this idea planted in my mind, and it's like it's a bar planted in concrete. It's extremely difficult for me to change my mind in a short notice. And, that's something that can be sort of a frustration point for the both of us is where I've already had that idea planted. You come to me and you're like, hey, I think we should consider something else. And for whatever reason, the way my mind works, like I get upset and just the notion of, oh my God, I have to change my plan now. And I was so sold on that. And then I'm like, my plan's good. I don't want to do that in that moment. And that's how I react. And it's not the best way, but that's just how it is. And then the reality is, you come to me multiple times and eventually I start to see the light. I'm like, you know what? That wouldn't be so bad. And eventually it's like, yeah, Jocelyn's right. Like usual. This is the more efficient. This is the better path. It makes more sense. And, I just have to take my idea out of that concrete, break it up a little bit, let myself mourn over it for a little while, if you will. And then I come around, generally speaking, when your idea is the more reasonable or logical or efficient one when it comes to that. And then also I'll say, usually when I come to you with big changes, like one of the big changes, like, okay, I really want to move across the country and I want to bring our whole family, let's do this. And then you're like, what? In that moment, you might react in that way. And then the thing for you though is that you have the capability to process that and change your mind about things very quickly in comparison to me.
Yeah, I mean, and by quickly, it still takes me usually like a day or two. And you have to, be the kind of person that takes moments of self-reflection and steps back a little bit and recognizes these patterns so that you can just adapt to them. So I think that's something that I've identified about myself is that when things change, I react similarly to you, but just on a much faster time frame. It usually takes me about a day to sleep on something and process it and to be okay with it. And since I know that about myself, I'll often, if I really check in with myself, I'll realize intellectually that it's a great idea and I agree with it and that my resistance to it is purely emotional. And I'll just tell you that, like, I agree with you. Let's do this, but I'm not going to be happy about it for like the next 24 hours. And, you've learned to just accept that like I'm probably going to grumble and be kind of pouty and throw a little fit about it for the first day. And then I'll be at like 100% on board. And, so I can sympathize with you in that I know what that experience is like of like having somebody come to you with an idea and it's not even that you disagree with it, but it's just so much work for you to let go of the old idea and, move into this new paradigm that you just don't want to do that work. And it's frustrating and it upsets you and you just feel a lot of feelings about it, even if you agree with it. So I sympathize and I know that you're like that. And so I know to bring my patience when it comes to bringing an idea to you that it probably will take 3 or 4 times for me to convince you. But that said, I think neither one of us has a huge ego and very rarely are Are we trying to figure out like who's right and who's wrong, or like wanting to win an argument just for the sake of being right? I think both of us are very, again, solutions oriented. And what we're always trying to figure out is just which is the best idea. And it doesn't matter whose idea it was. We just want the best thing. But sometimes emotions can get in the way of choosing the best thing if you feel really attached to something that you're already doing. Again, even though you might acknowledge intellectually, okay, you're right, this is a better idea, but I just need some time to let go of the old one. It's not about like, well, let me tell you why I'm right, because that almost always is going to end in people just digging their heels in and not wanting to compromise or find a solution. Whereas I think we are always with the mindset of whether it's personal or business, what's the best thing for our family? What's the best thing for us as a partnership? What's the best thing for our business? What's the best thing for our games? That's always the question for us. We elevate that above our own individual desires.
And I think to really echo what you're saying and to, foot stamp it there is that the big key is we are truly a partnership, whether it comes to marriage, the business. There's no sidekicks. We're both on the same level. We're both trying to help each other achieve our goals, whether that's joint or personal. And there's no deviance from that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the perspective that we bring to all aspects of both our personal and working relationship. And to answer the question specifically that we were asked, is that something that's always been present? I think so. And I think also something that people probably don't know, but we think of as being a very important aspect of our relationship is that we were both married and divorced before we met each other. And I think that experience for us, again, we're very logical, efficiency driven people. So, that first relationship, it's like we both came away from that and analyzed, okay, what went wrong? What wasn't right? Why weren't we compatible? What did I do wrong? What did they do wrong? And like, what am I going to do differently in order to find a better partner in the future? And so I think both of us, again, it can sound a little unromantic, but I think both of us kind of had a very clear checklist in our mind of what is the kind of person that I'm going to be able to build a life with and be happy and not have tons of issues with. And we both went and looked for that person. And then we were each other's person in that regard. And that's not how I think a lot of people approach relationships. For them, it's about like the romance and the passion and the sparks. And you and I are just not that person. We've both had that relationship and it did not end well. We both, I think, independently realized that we don't do well with fiery people. We need our fellow robot who can just, input data, output, result. So I don't feel like that's a huge arc in our relationship where we started off with tons of issues and then, we resolved them. Obviously, we've both learned and grown and improved our communication and understood each other better as time has gone on. But that was a requisite for me. I was not going to build a life with somebody that could not be a partner who always wanted to, put their individual opinions and desires above the partnership or the family. That just was never going to work for me.
Right. And one little side tidbit of information here is on our first date, it's kind of a joke, but, I was kind of done with dating on a less serious level and I wanted to be more serious. And I'm not advocating this as a style of how to do it, but on the first date, it was kind of like an interrogation. Like I was an FBI agent and I had my suspect there. And I was like, so, what do you like? Like, what kind of political leaning do you have?
Yeah, you asked about my politics.
Yeah, what are you looking for out of a relationship? And the reality is, those kind of questions, I just wanted to know. And I didn't want to waste time. Like I said, I had already been dating for multiple years at that point, and I wanted to find somebody who was serious about looking for a more romantic and long-term relationship.
What's funny about that is that I was much more recently divorced, and so I was still just kind of in like having fun, dating around mode. But at the same time, I found that really appealing. Like, again, I think we are both very similar in our ways of thinking, even though our personalities and our ways of doing things are very different. Like, I am not somebody who beats around the bush. I don't want to play games. I don't want to talk around things. I just want honest, direct communication. And that's too much for some people, right? But the fact that you were just straight up asking me on the first date, like, what are your political leanings? Like, what do you want in a relationship? That to me was like refreshing and caught my interest. And, I was kind of resistant to having a more serious relationship because I was still kind of healing and recovering from being divorced. But, I stuck with it because I saw promise and I knew it was worth it to stick with it. And, even if it took a while for me to be completely ready for a relationship. Like I wasn't ready to take the risk of like letting you go because that is such a rare thing to find, is somebody who's just willing to ask you those questions. I think the counterexample to that on the first date is that I told you I was divorced on our first date, and that surprised you because you said that was not something you typically told people on your
Right.
first date. But because I shared that, you felt emboldened to share it as well. So I think it's a perfect example of both of us just came at it with our normal approach to things, which is if you know what you want, just go for it. Just be honest and just be who you are. That is just both of us at our core. For me personally, I did a ton of therapy in my 20s. Maybe like 5 years of regular therapy. And so most of the skills that I have come from that. And that has to do not only with my communication with other people, but the communication that I have with myself. I think it's honestly even more important, the communication that you have with yourself. You can't be in a successful partnership if you don't have a good relationship with yourself. That's the primary thing. So I think that's something that I brought into the relationship is 5 years of therapy and internal work to, be my best person and to have those skills. I think prevents a lot of arguments. But if I'm having a bad day, I can forget all those skills and, arguments can definitely happen.
Little side piece of that, I have the utmost sympathy for those of you who do not have an internal dialogue. And I know some of you exist out there. I wish you had it because it's so useful as a tool.
For sure. Yeah. I wonder, I've heard that people that don't have an internal dialogue, like, a lot of them use like journaling and things like that, which just, feels kind of inefficient to me as opposed to just being able to have a conversation with yourself in your head. But if you don't know any different, then that's what you know. So when it comes to arguments, in my experience, generally, and definitely in our relationship, when we argue, it's never about the thing that we're arguing about. We're arguing about feelings. Somebody is having intense feelings, maybe about that topic or maybe about a totally different topic, and it's just bleeding into this. So I think that, again, the skills that I have typically allow me to identify if I'm having a feeling about something that is just a feeling that I'm having about something, I'm very quick to communicate that because that will prevent a lot of arguments in that. For example, one of my triggers is when I feel blindsided. So sometimes you do things without telling me. And if they are things that I like, then I don't even notice. I'm just like, great, I'm glad you took care of that. Thank you for not, making me spend time on that. But when you do things without telling me and I don't like them, which you have no way of predicting, then I feel blindsided. Like, why did you do this thing without me? And so I can get very triggered. And then, now I'm being forced to deal with a situation because I would never undermine you by undoing that thing, right? I do trust your judgment. So even if it's not the choice I would have made and I'm not happy with it, at the end of the day, I respect you and I trust your judgment. So I'm going to go with it and I'm going to make my peace with it. I'm going to make the best of it. But, it takes me a day or two to get there. And so that day that I'm unhappy about it, it can feel like a personal attack against you because you were the one that made the choice and I'm upset about it. And so I try to really clearly communicate, like, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at this situation and I will get used to this situation. So you just have to tolerate the fact that I'm a little grumpy about it. And then I think it's something that we've developed over time is that, you trust me and take me at my word when I say, I'm not mad at you. I'm just mad about the situation.
Right.
I'm not saying that just to appease you. And so you can better tolerate, like, if I'm in a bad mood over that.
Right. And, I certainly don't have as much experience, dealing with my emotions and processing them like you have. I haven't spent years of therapy on that. I have had some therapy, but it was on a much smaller scale for a much shorter time. And I certainly recognize, the benefits of having that and being able to process those emotions. But it's just something that I personally am going to have to get better at as time goes on. One other struggle that we've kind of had, I wouldn't necessarily say it was a big struggle, but something we've had to adjust to is, there have been various points in this adult game business where one of us has had the reins. We've been in charge, leading the charge. For me, it was earlier on with Prince Suburbia, back starting in 2017 and then taking a break and coming back to it. And then when we decided we were going to do this business, I was still working full-time as a web developer and you were doing it full-time. You were leading the charge and doing almost everything. And you had the power at that point. And then we had to get used to us both being on the same level when it came to both doing the business full-time. And that's a part of the blindsiding thing from my perspective is I still wasn't caught up to that mindset like, oh, I need to patch Jocelyn in on all the stuff that's going on with all the people that we're contracting out, the team members, et cetera.
But again, I would say that because we're solutions oriented people, after we had maybe 2 or 3 disagreements or arguments that were rooted in the fact that for me, like I said, I don't like being blindsided. We took a step back and we're like, let's change things so that we don't have this. And so now we have, a private server where we have all the communication together and we're much quicker to make a 3-way chat or make a channel where we can both be involved in something where, if it's coding stuff, I'm not going to keep up with that channel and read every little thing. But I can access it if I need to, and I can just catch up and, I can skim it and brief myself in what's going on. So like that was kind of, on me to identify, hey, if I'm feeling blindsided all the time, like I need to find a solution to this and fix it.
Right. And, if I were to say, I think this goes for, all business partnerships, whether it's two people or more, to just, keep them in the loop, however it is. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be everyone in all the conversations, but just to be apprised of what's going on so that they aren't blindsided either, and so that they know what's going on with the business, and so that they feel like they have the same stake as you do.
For sure. I think one of the reasons that you didn't always keep me in the loop when you came back to working on it full time, and you kind of reassumed some of the things that I had taken over, but then you took them back over when you were doing it full time. I think in your mind, you were trying to save me time and energy, right? You were like, Jocelyn has enough going on. I don't want to bother her with this. I don't want her to spend the mental energy to be updated on what's happening in this realm. And so again, I think that's where communication skills come into play, is being able to really take a step back and identify what were the motivations behind this. Your motivations were pure. You weren't trying to blindside me or do things behind my back. Not that I ever felt that way, or not that I ever thought that was true, but feelings are not always based in fact and reality. I certainly felt that way, even though I knew it wasn't true, but you had the best of intentions, right? And so being able to, once we're calmed down, really just get to the nitty gritty of like, why did you do what you did? And for me to explain, that's great that you want to, protect me from my time being sucked up in other things. But the reality is that it's worse for me to not know what's going on. Those types of things are, they require a lot of ongoing communication, and not only being honest with each other, but being honest with yourself. And I think those are all skills that we brought into the partnership already.
And then just another, little window that you can look in for how we operate. Like, I have no poker face. And whatever I'm feeling or thinking, like new ideas that are coming at me from Jocelyn or anybody for that matter, like you'll see how I'm feeling about it on my face. There's nothing I can do about it. I've tried over the years. It just doesn't happen. And a good example of that was when Jocelyn originally brought the walkthrough idea to me. I was initially extremely resistant, and I'm sure it was painted on my face clear as day. Yeah, it took me a lot of time to come around to the idea, the concept, and Jocelyn brought up many good points. But initially, I was like, oh my god, that is going to be a mountain of work. Like, it's going to slow us down, which it did, but it was 100% worth it.
Right. Yeah. I think the walkthrough is a great example of, where we both had to make a huge change in our mindset. I wasn't even fully convinced that we should do a walkthrough from the beginning, because I didn't want to feel like we were, again, appeasing players that were trying to make our game something that it wasn't. And I had to spend a lot of time in my own mind really working through my emotional reaction to, well, I don't want to appease players that are just complaining about something, to, can this be something that benefits the players that we do want to, attract and that we do want to reward? And it took me, I would say, a few months to work through that on my own. And so in that sense, I sympathize with you that when I came to you with it, it was like, I'd already had a few months of kind of stewing about it to come to terms with it. So I knew you would take the same amount of time probably to come to terms with it as well. Something that we talked about in one of the earlier episodes was how, because we do trust each other so much, or I think this maybe is something that only I experience, but I tend to trust your judgment on things without a lot of, thought about it. And so when it comes to like me bringing an idea to you, if you don't react positively to it, I typically walk away with this feeling of like, well, maybe he's right. Like, am I really sure that this is the best idea? And so I'll typically sit with myself for another few weeks and be like, well, he had some good points, but I really, for me, if it keeps coming back to me, then I'll come back to you and say, look, I know that you feel strongly about this, but it keeps coming into my mind, and I think I'm right. I think that's just an interesting thing, is that when you don't like something, it does make me doubt myself. Again, that goes to show that we don't have a lot of ego. It's more about like, what's the best idea? And I trust your judgment. So if you don't think it's a good idea, there's a chance that it's not a good idea. So that's probably better for us in the long run, though, that we spend a lot of time going back and forth and really thinking about whether ideas are good or not, instead of just kind of being emotionally attached to ideas and just like, well, I want to do my idea because it's right.
Right. And, I've used this expression a few times now. Like, I feel like I'm kind of a stone in the wind, and you're the wind, and you have to slowly wear me down sometimes. So, maybe just a few thousand years, and then you wear down the piece that's covering my eyelids, and I can open them like, oh, I see the light now. Like that makes a lot of sense.
For sure. So I hope we addressed your questions about how we handle differences in opinion and conflict. I'm sure this is a topic lots of people are interested in because it's relevant not only from a business perspective, but as we've said before, all of these skills that we brought into our business already existed in our marriage and our partnership. And we, I think we have a really strong relationship because of these skills that we have, and we just get to practice them more as business partners. So it only makes us stronger. We really appreciate all the thoughtful questions that we've received so far. We have a lot more to answer, and we can't wait to receive more of your questions, and we can't wait to answer them all.
Remember, if you have more questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out to us on our various platforms like Patreon, Subscribestar, Twitter. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Seedy AF podcast. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.